Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Oh, sorry. Amanda said that I had to sing. That's why there wasn't music tonight, because I wasn't about to subject you all to that. Hi, welcome to the Gender Justice Jam. I am your host, Aaron Scott. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the staff officer for gender justice for the presiding bishop's office of the Episcopal Church. So I work for the church at the denominational level to support all of our LGBTQ plus and women's ministries church-wide. And you are so lucky because you're joining us for session 9 of the Gender Justice Jam. And tonight's topic is reproductive justice. I'm just going to pause really quick and make sure folks have had a chance to join us on interpretation. Bienvenidos. Y si necesitan interpretación, hay un botón que parece como un pequeño planeta en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Hagan clic en él y elige español. And I want to acknowledge that we are calling in from many different lands tonight. So if you know the original people of the land you're currently on, go ahead and drop their name in the chat in honor of them. I'm usually calling in from the unceded lands of the Puyallup, but tonight I'm traveling. I'm in New York City, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people, and I extend my deepest gratitude to their past, present, and future generations. Tonight, we are super, super excited and honored to be joined by our special guest, Canon Kelly Brown Douglas. Canon Douglas is an Episcopal priest, a womanist, canon theologian for Washington National Cathedral, former Dean of Episcopal Divinity School, Dean Emeritus at Union Theological Seminary, and currently visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School, as well as the author of several theological works, including Black Christ, Sexuality in the Black Church, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, and I could keep going, but I'll save that time so that she can use it. And before we hear from Canon Douglas, we're going to do what we usually do in this series. We're going to ground ourselves in prayer, go over our covenant for safety and respect, and do a little bit of Bible study that Reverend Liz Theo Harris is going to lead us in. So if you'll join me in prayer, and if you want to drop any prayer requests you might have, folks who are on your heart, places that are on your heart tonight, you can drop them in the chat while we pray. God, you made us, and you made our bodies sovereign, sacred, sanctified, and in your own image. Bless our time together tonight as we study your word and your world through the teachings of Reverend Liz and Canon Kelly Brown Douglas. Help us hear you clearly tonight and keep kindling that fire in us as we set out to help you birth a world where all bodies are safe, all bodies are respected, and all bodies are able to thrive. We ask this in the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sanctifies all of us, no exceptions. Amen. A couple quick reminders about our sort of housekeeping safety notes. So we provide live simultaneous interpretation in the series in both Spanish and ASL. So excited to have folks joining us because of that interpretation from a wide range of corners of our church. And reminder about a round of applause really quick for our interpreting team. Thank you so much, Ricardo, Persis, and Erica. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then our reminders about safety. So we have a zero tolerance policy for bullying, harassment, threats, and hate speech in this series. And anyone who undertakes any of those things will be immediately removed from the Zoom room by our tech team and unable to rejoin future sessions. Reminder number 2, we can debate a lot of things in this class, but we are not going to debate the personhood, sanctity, or eligibility for spiritual leadership of LGBTQ plus people and our families in this class. And we are not debating whether all people deserve safe and legal access to reproductive health care. We're also not debating whether people deserve to live free from violence in all forms. And if you have questions about any of those positions, you can refer to the stances of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. Then just a quick reminder, this is a public series. We do record these sessions. We share them on the Episcopal Church website as well as on Spotify for folks who are unable to join us live. So you can ask questions, you can share some of your story, but just be mindful that in asking your questions, you don't disclose any information about people that shouldn't be disclosed. So you can talk about maybe you have somebody in your life who just came out to you as trans. Don't say their name. Don't say this is my nephew. He goes to St. Aidan's Episcopal Church with me. Just say there's a young person who I love who's going through this. And likewise, just keep that in mind for yourself. We welcome people sharing their testimonies. We also understand that sometimes it's not safe to do that. So we just want you to honor yourself as you decide what you share. And finally, if you have any tech issues, just drop it in the chat. Amanda is our excellent tech lead for tonight, so you can chat them any questions. I think that's it for housekeeping. So let's do our Bible study. For each session of this Gender Justice Jam, we do a little bit of Bible study, talk about it, and then we'll move to our presentation. And tonight we have Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris of the Cairo Center, who's actually going to be taking us through 3 texts. So we've got Psalm 139, Exodus 21, and Proverbs 8, all circling around this question of reproductive justice. So I think let's pin Liz, and Amanda, if we could put up our or maybe we don't need to pin Liz yet. Let's put up our slides first for Psalm 139. We'll read these in English and Spanish. So if we can pull up the English first and get a volunteer to read Psalm 139. You just hit your little hand raise button. Awesome. Kristen, go for it.
You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book, before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Let's put the Spanish up, and then I wonder if we could get a volunteer in Spanish. If you can hit your hand raise button and read the Spanish for us. Anybody want to read in Spanish tonight? Yes, please. Thank you. Catherine.
Señor, tú me has examinado y me conoces. Tú conoces todas mis acciones. Aún de lejos te das cuenta de lo que pienso. Sabes todas mis andanzas. Sabes todo lo que hago. Aún no tengo la palabra en la lengua. Y tú, Señor, ya la conoces. Por todos lados me has rodeado. Tienes puesta tu mano sobre mí. Sabiduría tan admirable está fuera de mi alcance. Es tan alta que no alcanzo a comprenderla. ¿A dónde podría ir lejos de tu espíritu? ¿A dónde huiría lejos de tu presencia? Si yo subiera a las alturas de los cielos, allí estás tú. Y si bajara a las profundidades de la tierra, también estás allí. Si levantará el vuelo hacia el oriente, o habitará en los límites del mar occidental, aún allí me alcanzaría tu mano. Tu mano derecha no me soltaría. Si pensara esconderme en la oscuridad, o que se convirtiera en noche la luz que me rodea, la oscuridad no me ocultaría de ti, y la noche sería tan brillante como el día. La oscuridad y la luz son lo mismo para ti. Tú fuiste quien formó todo mi cuerpo. Tú me formaste en el vientre de mi madre. Te alabo porque estoy maravillado, porque es maravilloso lo que has hecho. De ello estoy bien convencido. No te fue oculto el desarrollo de mi cuerpo, mientras yo era formado en lo secreto, mientras era formado en lo más profundo de la tierra. Tus ojos vieron mi cuerpo en formación. Todo eso estaba escrito en tu libro. Habías señalado los días de mi vida, cuando aún no existía ninguno de ellos. Oh Dios, qué profundos me son tus pensamientos. Infinito es el conjunto de ellos. Si yo quisiera contarlos, serían más que la arena. Y si acaso terminara, aún estaría contigo. Oh Dios, quítales la vida a los malvados y aleja de mí a los asesinos, a los que hablan mal de ti y se levantan en vano en contra tuya. Señor, ¿no odio acaso a los que te odian y desprecio a los que te desafían? Los odio con todo mi alma. Los considero mis enemigos. Oh Dios, examíname, reconoce mi corazón, ponme a prueba, reconoce mis pensamientos, mira si voy por el camino del mal y guiarme por el camino eterno.
Gracias, Catherine. Thank you. So I wonder, maybe, Liz, do you want to start with this one before we jump to the other texts?
Yeah, I was thinking it would be great
Okay.
to spend a minute or two on this. And again, we're going to be quick, but it felt important as we enter a week where we're looking at the question of reproductive justice to start with this text. And I'm wondering if, I don't know, if there's like almost a show of hands, or if anyone wants to jump in real quick and say if you've heard this text, if this text has been used in contexts that you are aware of. If you have any feelings, positive or less positive about this text, just wanting to do a little bit of a survey almost for a second here. Andy says, I've read this text, but never considered it in light of reproductive rights. Awesome. Thank you. Sydney says, likewise. Catherine says, it was used in the Rite 13 liturgy, discontinued recently. Kristen is saying that people use this to justify pro-life stances. Christy saying, heard it to use by pro-life pundits. And Aaron, thanks for this. On the one hand, you love this text. On the other hand, definitely heard it as anti-abortion activists use it. Right. Michelle saying, weaponized against people who need access to abortion. And then Kristen saying, but not hearing that last part before. And Jennifer, thanks, pointing to God, having an intimate relationship with us is how we hear it often. So as a biblical scholar, often the first place I start when I'm looking at a text is the internet. Because I feel like it's the right place to go. And usually when you put a text in, Bible Gateway or Bible Hub or some other kind of Bible program on the internet pops up. But if you put in this psalm, what pops up is another website, and it's for the, it's called the Psalm 139 Project. And it's a kind of fundraising website to make sure that folk are sending their money in to make sure that pregnancy crisis centers have ultrasounds. So as people who can get pregnant are making their decisions about what to do with those pregnancies, they've gone through an ultrasound where they've seen the fetus inside them. And then the next, 2 or 3 texts are again not Bible Gateway or Bible Hub or any of these programs that tell us what the Bible says, but you get like Focus on the Family, right? And what's being said there is my favorite is like right on top. Like, this verse shows that God knows the preborn. He was the one who created the tiny life and planned the days of their life. And therefore, while the Bible doesn't say abortion, it does say God's creation and care for life while in the womb. And what you can kind of see when you look at this text online, or if you kind of follow various commentaries, is a debate around what this text says to kind of justify a lack of access to abortions, and really a text that becomes a clobber passage around abortion and abortion access. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of start there, but also to read it, not just as Psalm 139, verse 13, but to see that whole text. Because then it's, I think, easier to see much of the way people have been talking about this, which is that this is really a text that's about, it's about a lot of things. I'm not one to ever say that this text is about, but it's clearly detailing how God is holding up and caring for, in this case, David. But then I think we're able to apply that to our own selves, and knows everything about us and is everywhere we go. And so it just felt important for us to start and think a little bit about this text, and talk a little bit about then, therefore, the context of it, and then wanted to put it really quickly into conversation with these two other texts. And if we look at the text, and I don't know if it's helpful to have it up or if it makes it too hard with the interpretation.
I'll drop it in the chat.
Perfect. Thanks. I think what's important about this that the verse 13, you created my innermost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. And then verse 14, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I think there's an interesting kind of conversation happening here. For one, often verse 13 is used by anti-choice, anti-abortion proponents to say that life begins in the womb and an abortion is going against God. There's lots of different interpretations of that, but in general, the overall interpretation is that 13 is a text that speaks against abortion. But then verse 14 is often a text that speaks to like the all-inclusive nature of God, because God made us each fearfully and wonderfully. And I think one of the things that's really important here is that in fact, verse 14 has been used by many communities, including LGBTQ communities, to talk about how God loves us all. But then also this text right before it is often used to kind of against reproductive justice. But as has already been mentioned in the chat, if we're going to read literally this idea that God knit us together in our mother's wombs, we also have to see that life begins in this story in the depths of the earth, and before anyone was created, that God, knew us and created us from those depths. And so, again, I think it's really important for us to kind of notice the selective when we have a literal translation versus when we don't. We literally are in this passage are being told that we're made from dirt, that we're there from the beginning, before the beginning of the world, and before the creation of the world with God. And yet we also, but also then it's used in this way to talk about, being in a mother's womb. So really appreciating some of the conversation that's happening here. So, and Kristen, you're kind of anticipating the reason that I think it's also then helpful for us to talk a little bit then about what does the Bible say and what do some of these traditions teach about abortion. And, I think it's important for us to perhaps now go to the Exodus 21 passage, and wondering if someone might be willing to read this, because while, again, this text actually isn't talking about abortion, it is talking about a miscarriage of of a of a of a fetus in a woman's womb. So is someone able to and willing to read this passage?
Andy, it's all you.
When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe.
And maybe someone would be willing to read it in Spanish.
I can read it in Spanish if we don't have another volunteer. Si dos hombres se pelean y llegan a lastimar a una mujer embarazada, haciéndola abortar, pero sin poner en peligro su vida, el culpable deberá pagar de multa lo que el marido de la mujer exija, según la decisión de los jueces. Pero si la vida de la mujer es puesta en peligro, se exigiría vida por vida, ojo por ojo, diente por diente, mano por mano, pie por pie, quemadura por quemadura, herida por herida, golpe por golpe.
Thank you so much, gracias. So this isn't an easy text, but it seems to be one of the only ones that exists in the Bible that talks about a miscarriage. And so one of the things I think is important for us to kind of note here is that while it's saying that if a person is hurt or harmed, then it's kind of this eye for an eye. If there's a miscarriage of a fetus, the punishment is significantly less, which some folks have then said that it's clear from these texts that it's, you can't kind of debate out necessarily, or at least come to an easy conclusion about kind of what the Bible says about abortion, or about a termination of a fetus. And so again, I'm not saying this is an easy text. I'm not saying there's one way to interpret it, but it seemed important to kind of put it in conversation. Aaron, I don't know if also you wanted to jump in at all about this kind of also just the issue of abortion in our text. I'm also happy to do it, but
yeah.
Something.
And we were talking about this class. Liz and I had prior conversations about just the total, even by the admission of people who are stridently anti-abortion theologians. Like, you can go to their websites, and one of the first things you see if you're just Googling, right, like, what does the Bible say about abortion? The first thing everybody says is the Bible doesn't actually have the word abortion in it. So even in that realm, there's this recognition that is not being talked about. So then there is this taking these other texts and trying to fit them into that platform. But I think looking historically, especially for me, when I look at the Gospels, and knowing what we know about everyday life in the era of the Roman Empire, people were having abortions during the life of Jesus. Abortion was common. It was very different than it is today, but it was very much practiced. And Jesus does not say one thing about it. And he seems to be a person who talks about things that are important to him. So I just feel like for me, that's the piece that that is really kind of central to this. Like when we're talking about what the Bible does and does not say. Um, yeah, that's what I have in mind. I don't know if you were thinking about some other stuff, Liz.
No, that's great. And I don't know if folks want to kind of keep on talking in the chat a little bit. We won't go on much longer because I'm very excited for Canon Kelly Brown Douglas to join us. But again, I think it's like partially what we're trying to do here is just think about what does the Bible say and not say about abortion and reproductive justice and not about abortion and reproductive justice. And so I want to do one more move. If we're thinking about this back to the Psalm 139 text, and this kind of being there at the beginning, I then want us to look a little bit at this Proverbs 8 text, and I wanted to just kind of introduce it because I think, again, it's sometimes really helpful for us to have these different images of creation, of God. And this is one that I think it's helpful to put in conversation with that Psalms text. This is one where many theologians and biblical scholars will talk about this kind of divine feminine that sometimes is named Sophia. In fact, my daughter's name is Sophia after this passage, after this kind of divine wisdom, because here's another text of the creation and who's with and what's with God as we're being formed. And so, if someone would be willing to read this text, that would be amazing.
Listen, go ahead.
The Lord created me as the beginning of his ways, for the sake of his works. Before the age he founded me in the beginning. Before he made the earth, and before he made the depths, before he brought forth the springs of the waters, before the mountains were established, and before all the hills, he begets me.
And so, yes, this is this text from Proverbs 8. And it just seemed like helpful to put in conversation. Maybe we can also hear the Spanish.
Thank you, Andy. Go ahead.
El Señor me creó al principio de su obra, antes de que Él comenzara a crearlo todo. Me formó en el principio del tiempo, antes de que creara la tierra. Me engendró antes de que existieran los grandes mares, antes de que brotaran los ríos y los manantiales. Antes de afirmar los cerros y los montes, el Señor ya me había engendrado.
Ok. ¿Sí me escuchan?
Oh, sí,
El Señor me creó al principio de su obra, antes de que Él comenzara a crearlo todo. Me formó en el principio del tiempo, antes de que creara la tierra. Me engendró antes de que existieran los grandes mares, antes de que brotaran los ríos y los manantiales. Antes de afirmar los cerros y los montes, el Señor ya me había engendrado.
Gracias. So just thinking, we could probably even take these texts down so we can see each other a little bit better. But wondering if just for maybe 2 more minutes, if anyone had any insights, any thoughts, made any connections either between or among these 3 texts or just about the topic, just kind of what's on your heart, what jumped out at you.
I see Miranda's hand up. Miranda, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems so common sense, but it had never occurred to me that abortions were happening during the time that Jesus was alive. And it's going to be blowing my mind for a while, I think.
Yeah.
A really important point.
I felt the same way when I read that for the first time.
Just appreciating some of the things that folks have put in the chat also. So please read if you can. And then Antonis.
And if you want to hear, if you speak English and you want to hear Anthony's question translated, go down to your interpretation button and hit English. Anthony's, go ahead and ask your question.
Ok, gracias. Solo que quisiera o pensaba que en términos de la creación, de ser engendrados o ser creados, no sé, yo creo que hay una diferencia, ¿no? A veces las grandes discusiones que se suelen hacer desde la interpretación de los textos bíblicos es el tema de la creación, ¿no? Creó hombre, mujer y lo hizo así, lo sacó de la costilla, lo hizo del barro, sopló, todas estas cosas. Pero frente a eso mismo, acá estamos hablando de engendrar. Engendrar y qué significa engendrar para nosotros. Y creo que casi toda la palabra de Dios en eso apunta a que incluso no está mucho más allá de la creación. Estamos precisamente desde la interpretación del texto bíblico, desde el que siempre se ha hecho la lectura de la creación, sino que es a veces mucho antes, ¿no? Mucho antes, desde el inicio, desde antes de crear ya estábamos engendrados. Y eso siempre ha estado mucho conmigo. Y además cuando uno lee los textos del Nuevo Testamento donde hay afirmaciones muy grandes de que somos engendrados o que somos creados pero en Cristo Jesús, no, o sea, en la persona de Jesucristo, y pareciera ser que no es antes. Entonces creo que son un poco como los términos o los medios en los que nos tendríamos que mover para entender que no hay ni una puntualidad en términos ni de creación, en términos de creación, sino que por el contrario, parece ser que de la única certeza que sí podemos tener es que somos engendrados en Dios y por Dios, y que la creación, en el caso de los cristianas, es en la persona adorable de Jesús y su seguimiento, o su reconocimiento, o su aceptación como hijo de Dios, como Señor y como Salvador, ¿no? Mil gracias.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the reflections and the chat. And Erin, I think it's time for us to move to the next part.
And I think the next part is to have Reverend Dr. Canon Dean Kelly Brown Douglas with us, talking to us about a theology of reproductive justice. Thank you so much, Canon Douglas, for being with us tonight. And the floor is yours. And let us know whenever you want the slides to go up.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And I could have listened and continued, Dr. Liz, with the Bible study all night. And I, too, as some said in the chat, was just hearing these three texts together and in conversation with each other really, in many ways, opened them up even more. And it's a good segue, I think, into what we will be doing now. And so if you could put up the first slide, start the slides for me. There we go. to end, I want to also thank everyone else for being here and allowing me to be a part of this conversation that you have been a part of over a series of weeks. Let's begin. Of course, tonight we're talking about reproductive justice. And so I want to begin at a place which may be for some of you just a reminder of that which you already know. And for others, it can be perhaps new information. I want to start with, yes, talking about what we mean by reproductive justice so that we can then begin to understand why we are even thinking about theology in that regard, a theology of reproductive justice. And as we begin with what we mean by reproductive justice, I want to start with where that phrase, where that term came from. Does anyone, just a sort of a show of hands, does anyone know who coined the phrase reproductive justice? Sort of a show of hands if you do or not. Well, this is where I want to begin. Many don't realize that phrase, that term, reproductive justice, was actually a phrase coined in 1994 by a group of women of color, specifically by Black women, a Black women's caucus that was a part of a meeting on reproductive justice. Well, it wasn't called reproductive justice. They were part of a meeting in Chicago in 1995 and 1994, in June of 1994, on a national pro-choice conference. There was a Black women's caucus that was a part of that conference, and many from that conference, as well as particularly Black women, had just returned from an international conference on population and development in Cairo, Egypt. And at that conference, they were exploring the use of a human rights framework and sort of understanding reproductive rights. It was at that conference that Black women began to recognize the limitations of the sort of pro-choice language. They didn't feel that the pro-choice language in many respects went far enough, and particularly in understanding some of the experiences, especially of Black women, when it came to reproductive health, when it came to creating the kind of environment, the kind of space in which reproductive health for Black women can indeed be fostered and can indeed become a reality. And so they keep on reproductive. Thank you. So they coined this term, reproductive justice. A woman by the name of Loretta Ross is given credit for coining this term. And so what is it that they were trying to get at, and what is it today that we mean when we talk about reproductive justice? And reproductive justice, while it includes and is inclusive of reproductive rights, abortion, pro-choice rights, et cetera, it also is about more than that. It is this sort of framework that they began to create that connected reproductive justice to, in fact, social justice. They connected reproductive justice and reproductive rights, if you will, to human rights. And so they envisioned that when we talk about reproductive justice, they envisioned a society, if you will, and I'm borrowing their language, where human rights are actually put into practice. So reproductive justice was this sort of wider framework, this wider vision for social justice organizing and advocacy. Always, because we're talking about as it's emerging in particular from women of color. So this whole framework for discussing reproductive justice and understanding it in relationship to social justice means that they're always understanding it as a part of these sort of intersecting and interactive realities of social justice, of social struggle, etc. And so their belief was that reproductive justice could, in fact, and again, I'm using their language, could in fact only be achieved when all people have the economic, social, political power and other resources to make their own decisions about their bodies, their health, their sexuality, their families, and reproduction. In this regard, they believe that sort of in these sort of three kind of tenets, three core, as they said, three core tenets of reproductive justice, which was the right to have children or the right not to have children and the right to parent in safe and healthy environments. And so when we think of reproductive justice, we should always think of it intrinsically related to wider issues of social justice. And we will see why that becomes significant in a minute when we talk about reproductive justice when we talk about reproductive justice. Let's move to the next slide, if you will. So, now, what does reproductive justice have to do with theology? First of all, I always like to start out by saying what theology is and what theology is not. And so theology is, as I often say, is God talk. But what's important to know is that in theology, it is not God doing the talking. It are human beings who are doing the talking about God. Human beings trying to understand the meaning of God and the meaning of God's revelation as they navigate their own living realities, their own experience. And so in this regard, theology is faith seeking understanding. That is an attempt to understand one's faith in God as one navigates the questions, the contradictions, the challenges of living, the challenges of life. And so in this regard, when we talk about theology in relationship to reproductive justice, how are we to understand our faith? How are we to understand our relationship to God and what that means and the meaning of God as we navigate the questions, the issues, the challenges that emerge in relationship to the broader issues of reproductive justice? And I'll talk about some of those broader specific issues in a moment. So that's why, and whether we recognize that we're doing theology, we are, as people of faith, as people who believe in God, we are always, as we were doing in this Bible study, right, trying to understand the meaning and significance of God and our faith in that God as we navigate these questions of abortion, pro-choice, etc., and so on, all these related issues when it comes to reproductive justice and reproductive health, the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to parent and raise those children in safe and healthy environments. I just like us to keep that framework as we're thinking about reproductive justice. So how are we to understand this God who we just heard in the biblical the lesson that we just had, this God of life, this God who protects life, this God who nurtures life. So what is sort of the theological, if you will, foundation or the core theological principle as we engage this discussion of reproductive justice? Sort of the core theological principle in this regard is what we're all familiar with, the notion of imago Dei. So God created humans, as it says in Genesis, in God's own image. What precisely does that mean, and what in the world does that have to do with reproductive justice? When we think of imago Dei, I think we can think about it in sort of two ways, or two sort of components to this theological concept, biblical concept of imago Dei. The first aspect of that is that it suggests, when we talk about humans being created in the image of God, it suggests that there is something about human beings that enable them to reflect in some ways the very image of God. There is something about human beings that have the potential for showing forth who God is. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is what we heard in the second, I think it was in Exodus 21, that scripture. And that is that God, because we are created in God's own image, that God has created us, that God absolutely cares about every single solitary human being without exception. Right? And so that I often like to say, all who have breath, have ever had breath, because the breath we have that gives us life is the breath of God, that all who have breath, God cares about. Right? God cares about every little hair on our heads, as scripture tells us. What this means, then, if we think of it in broad strokes in terms of imago Dei, is that human beings possess an inherent sacred dignity. Every human being who's been created by God, and as far as I know, that's everybody. Until someone shows me different, everybody that has breath carries the divine breath of God, is created by God, which means that very breath, the very fact that we are created in the image of God, without exception, means that every single human being doesn't have to earn it, but has inherently divine sacred dignity. Which means, then, that we are called to respect the sacred dignity of every single human being. Now, that brings us to this matter again of reproductive justice. You can switch the slides for me there. Now, in order to really begin to understand the challenge and the theological challenge when it comes to reproductive justice, we have to ask ourselves, so what is it that gets in the way of reproductive justice? Why are we talking about it? How do we get here? We often talk about reproductive justice, but we don't often talk about reproductive violence. reproductive injustice, if you will, is violent. So what do we mean when we talk about reproductive violence, right? Especially as we think about, again, always think about reproductive justice in relationship to issues of social justice. Think about reproductive justice as the right to have children, the right to choose not to have children, the right to have your own sort of bodily agency, and the right to parent, to raise children in healthy, life-giving, if you will, environments. So when we think about reproductive violence is a form of social and gender-based violence that, yes, targets reproductive autonomy. It targets one's ability, right, to have or not have children, and it targets one's ability to live in a health and safe environment where one can indeed make choices and has the ability to make choices that indeed foster life. Reproductive violence is, as the UN has described, is a distinct form of sexual and gender-based violence that is protected, that is reproductive justice is protected under international law, even as reproductive violence has been historically ignored. So what do we mean? I'm going to give just a few examples of even how the UN, right, has talked about and documents reproductive violence. One, of course, they talk about reproductive coercion, right? And we can think about reproductive coercion in many ways, but when we talk about reproductive coercion, we're talking about people being coerced or forced into bearing children that they don't want to have. And so reproductive coercion is also being forced not only sort of by outside forces, be it the government or whatever, by laws, et cetera, policies, et cetera, but also being forced as a part of sort of intimate partner, if you will, kind of violence. And in fact, one study found that over 11% of female identifying young adults experienced reproductive coercion in their lifetime, right? Reproductive violence is also what we see when we are talking about maternal mortality rates that indeed can be avoided. And what we indeed find is that this high rate of maternal mortality is typically preventable. What we know is that women of African descent in our country face a higher mortality rate compared to white women. Indeed, we have found that, and we know that Black women's mortality rate is 3 times that of the national average. Indigenous and other ethnic minorities in the U.S. also face a high mortality rate. And in fact, the U.S. Faces a higher maternal mortality rate than other countries, other quote unquote economically developed countries. That, again, is an example of, in fact, reproductive violence. We can talk about, and I won't hear perhaps in discussion, the reasons that this is the case. It has to do with the social injustice, right? Again, why these Black women wanted to always connect these issues of reproductive rights, what they call reproductive justice, with social justice, because those things go intimately together. When we talk about reproductive violence, we also have to talk about the violence that is perpetuated by anti-LGBTQ kind of bills and policies. We know that currently the ACLU is tracking at least 484 anti-LG, or actually over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills, and over 100 bills that are attacking transgender persons and preventing those persons from what? Those persons from indeed accessing gender-affirming care. As of August of this year, 2024, over 39% of trans youth aged 13 to 17 are living in the 26 states that have passed bans on gender-affirming care. That's reproductive violence. So again, when we think about reproductive justice, we think of what reproductive justice is not. Why we have to discuss and fight for reproductive justice because of reproductive violence. And we can understand the meaning of all of these things, again, just bringing all of this together. And I think we always have to connect these things when we talk about reproductive justice and reproductive violence. We have to connect them always to the wider realities of social justice and social injustice in our country and in our world. And let's say one other little interesting fact that we don't think about, and that is the relationship between climate change and environmental degradation, if you will, and the relationship between it and reproductive violence. And in fact, one of the things that we know is that climate change and increases the risk of violence against girls and women due to their displacement, due to resource scarcity, food insecurity, disruption to services, etc. And that it is estimated that about 80% of people who are displaced by climate change are in fact women. And we know that as women are displaced, that there is a higher rate of rapes that these women indeed suffer, must endure. And so, again, we never think about the way in which climate change, which causes displacement, the way in which it too is related to these realities of reproductive justice. Again, always holding these two things together. So what's our response? What does it mean for us theologically? Well, we know that we are mandated, it seems, we are compelled by the notion that we are all created in the image of God. We are compelled then by that notion to indeed respect the sacred dignity of every human being. And that in this conversation means we are compelled to indeed foster and nurture reproductive justice, which means that we are compelled, and you can change the slide, to stop the violence. So when we think of violence and stopping the violence, and I will move through this pretty quickly, I want us to begin to think about violence in sort of three different ways. And then when we do that, we can then begin to understand what our responses have to be to foster reproductive justice. A Norwegian sociologist by the name of Johann Galtine. I typically mispronounce his name, I'm sure, but it's Galtun. He is considered the pioneer, if you will, of peace studies, and he provides us with I believe, very useful way to begin to understand the realities of violence. You can switch the slide, if you will. And he talks about violence in three ways, as we could see from the previous slide. And I want to use this slide to sort of show how these forms of violence interact. He talks about direct violence. Direct violence, as he says, is best understood as an event, and so it is sort of a direct, visible attack, affront, assault upon, in this instance, we'll talk about human beings, upon human bodies, right? And we can think of that in terms of war or other sort of physical acts. We can think about that in terms of famine that causes displacement. We can think about that in terms of rape. We can think about that in terms of the other forms of assault and violence that directly impact a person's body, assaults on the body. We can think about that in terms of anti-LGBTQ plus violence and assaults, and we know that LGBTQ plus persons are indeed targeted with direct violence. We can think about that in terms of the direct violence and assault upon women's bodies. And so it's a physical act. It's sort of a direct, if not immediate threat to one's body, a direct and not immediate, if not immediate threat to one's life. As Galtang says, direct violence is cruelty perpetuated by human beings against each other, as well as other forms of life and nature in general. Then there's structural violence, right? And structural violence is this, as Galtang says, sort of this process with its ups and downs that really creates insidious patterns of exploitation, inequality, oppression, and overall injustice. Structural violence in this regard is systemic structural realities that perpetuate, if you will, reproductive violence. Laws, policies, the way in which systems are organized, the kind of structural realities that indeed oppress, marginalize, and don't respect the dignity of women, LGBTQ plus persons, and others. That's the way in which reproductive violence, and we can talk about and think about the ways in which reproductive violence is indeed embedded within our very structures and systems. Sometimes that's readily visible to us, and sometimes it's not. And then lastly, related is cultural violence, which oftentimes is invisible to us and we aren't really aware of it. But as Galtine describes, cultural violence operates in that sort of symbolic sphere of our existence, right? The ways in which our culture perpetuates the kind of reproductive violence that thwarts, if you will, reproductive justice. Cultural violence is is found in the language and in art and in religion. And this way, cultural violence is about this sort of slow transformation process that ultimately distorts our thinking and corrupts, like I like to say, our moral imaginary, making direct and structural violence appear and feel right, or in the least not wrong. And we can talk about ways in which that occurs when we're speaking of reproductive violence, when we're speaking of reproductive justice or the lack thereof, the way in which cultural violence, our language, our ideologies, our religion, like we were looking at these texts, makes it look like it's okay, it's right, it's acceptable to not allow people to have their own bodily autonomy, to not allow people to be whomever it is that God created them to be, that we create this whole sort of culture of violence that suggests that certain people don't have the right to flourish and to whomever they have been created to be. So bans on trans health care, bans on women's right to choose, all of those things began to look right, or at least not wrong. And so cultural violence in the end is that which renders direct and structural violence acceptable. In this sort of our theological understanding, it's the way religion is an aspect of culture, and it's the way in which we use religion to make reproductive violence look acceptable. The way in which it becomes acceptable to us, and almost in such a way that we are masked. We can't even see it. We can't even, as the UN has said, that it becomes overlooked. Reproductive violence itself is that which becomes overlooked. And I see we're moving toward the end. So I just want to say a couple more things and then just open it up for conversation and discussion. And one thing that I forgot to mention, and when we talked about what it means to be created in the image of God, is that one of the things that it becomes very clear when we think about God and God's creation, and this becomes key in understanding the route to reproductive justice, and that is that God's creation has never been binary. It's not a binary creation. No aspect of that which God has created is binary. Well, God and God's self is not binary. If we affirm sort of the sort of Christian language of a triune God, that resists any binary categorizations, right? And so I could talk much more about that, but so that we have to understand the creation, including human creation, is not a binary creation. And so in that regard, again, we are called to respect the dignity of all of God's creation. You can move to the last slide here. And so what does that mean, particularly as we're in this Episcopal context? That's our challenge, right? And I didn't get to, and we can talk about, if you will, some of the ways and what that looks like in practical ways. But it's a part of, in the Episcopal Church, and if not other churches, the baptismal covenant, which says, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? And we answer, we will, with God's help. That is the foundation for fighting for reproductive justice and stopping the violence that is at once direct, that is, and you can switch the slide so that we can show that in Spanish, that is at once direct, that is at once structural, and that is at once cultural. And so again, we can talk about ways to begin to particularly address it if you like. But there is an inherent relationship between reproductive justice and who we claim to be as people of faith. Our call in respecting the dignity of every human being is to stop the violence that is reproductive violence. I'll stop there and hope that that sort of broad framework at least inspires and provokes further thought and further conversation.
Canon Douglas, thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your theology, your expertise, all of it. I have questions, but I already talked. So let's open it up for folks. What jumped out at you about this presentation, or what's on your spirit, what's on your mind, about this question of reproductive justice, specifically for us as people of faith? And you can put your hand raise button up, or you can drop questions, comments in the chat. Let's hear from some folks.
I got muted.
Sorry, I was just reading. Ariel shared in the chat, I love that part of the baptismal covenant. That's where I am directly included, and a call to action to bring justice in the way that I can. Absolutely. I see Sydney's got a hand up.
Just so moved by this because I've been thinking about sexual violence in terms of the women that are bleeding out in the hospital. About an African American couple in Texas, and she died because they would not do a BNC. The BNC has become a very fearful thing for doctors to do because they're afraid of being arrested. It broke my heart, as it does over and over and over again. I think that this election cycle just torn me to pieces, and it was so fearful that all I can turn to is the church and prayer. Because it's so big and there's so much violence around it for all of our siblings that are LGBTQI, all women that are of reproductive age. It is appalling, and the men who love them. Anyway, it's just been on my heart so deeply.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Sydney. We put Kristen put in the chat the connection of reproductive violence and reproductive justice. All new thinking for me. It's really good. I wonder if other folks have thoughts they want to come off mute. Just raise your hand and share. We'd love to hear a few other people.
Sorry about that. Maybe I was just speaking loudly enough. I'm usually loud.
So, it looks like, Spanish interpretation had a little bit of trouble hearing your audio for that question.
Yeah. Well, people think, one of the things, particularly as we think about, there are obvious ways in which we recognize reproductive violence and perhaps don't recognize it as violent, but now have to call it out. And some of those ways are indeed, Sydney, what you just mentioned, the laws and the bans that are going in effect in terms of gender affirming care, laws that are and policies that are in effect in several states that prevent women from getting the kind of health care and reproductive care that they need. And so we need to name it as that and name it violence because that's indeed what it is. The other thing that I want to say, and then I'll shut up because I see a couple of other hands, is that we also have to recognize cultural violence. And we're talking about this, of course, in terms of reproduction. And I like to say sometimes we have to do, even within the spaces in which we are a part of, and in our religious spaces, in our church spaces, we have to do what I call a sort of violence audit, right? And particularly when it comes to cultural violence, and to really begin to do an audit and say, what are the ways in which we perpetuate cultural violence? In this regard, what are the ways in which we perpetuate cultural violence in relationship to reproductive justice? What are the ways? And so when we think about, well, what do you mean? What are the ways in which we perpetuate cultural violence? What are the ways in which we wittingly or unwittingly, right, don't allow for, I think in our churches, we think everyone's created in the image of God, then we ought to have images and icons that reveal that. Otherwise, we're perpetuating cultural violence, right? Because we're perpetuating that perhaps not in what we say, but in what we don't say, right? How are we perpetuating cultural violence, reproductive violence and cultural violence in our own households, by what we read. We're talking about the way we raise our families, or what we read, what we don't read, what images are there, what images are what they're, in the language we use. And in the language we don't use. And so I always say, we have to do, it starts at home. Before we sort of look out there, let's begin to do this kind of violence audit within the spaces in which we occupy, particularly when it comes to cultural violence, because it is cultural violence that makes acceptable structural and direct violence.
Awesome. I see. All right, let's do Michelle and then Antonice for our last two questions. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I so appreciated the line around visible violence and invisible violence, in part because I think so often what helps those of us who are not as proximate as others to the visible direct violence, it's encountering that helps us learn to unspool the things that lead to it, right? And so it's the recognition, either because of someone I love has been hurt, or I've read about something that horrifies me, or I have encountered violence in some way that is so visible that you cannot look away from it, that you have to then do the work to back up, and the dissonance between the theology that we hold and the way that we treat each other becomes clearer. So I just am grateful for that juxtaposition. And as I continue to unravel those things, right, and learn to see them better and be able to share them better in the communities where I am. So I just appreciated that and was noticing how important it was to me to make those connections as I started on this path and as I continue. So.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Antonice, your turn. And if you need to hear Antonice translated into English, go to your interpretation button and select English. Go ahead, Antonice.
Oh, mil gracias, Aaron, y muy agradecido también por este acercamiento a poder detectar aquellas violencias que no a veces no están como tan visibles, ¿verdad? A veces en los propios discursos religiosos. Yo recuerdo que hace algún tiempo el tema de ser imagen de Dios se separaba quizás un tanto de la realidad, ¿verdad? Y quizás era usado para decir que teníamos un llamado a una santidad que nos lleva incluso a renunciar de nuestra sexualidad, ¿no? Porque el cuerpo es malo, porque hay pecado, porque hay una cantidad de cosas. Y creo que eso es bien interesante desde hacer una observación también desde ser imagen de Dios, ¿verdad? Desde ser creados a imagen de Dios. Y que ser creados a imagen de Dios también implica que Dios habita en mí, habita en nosotras y en nosotros, y que cualquier cosa que sea hecha con cualquiera de nosotros es también una violencia contra Dios, porque hacemos parte de la habitación de la divinidad, ¿no? Entonces creo que eso es un punto de partida muy, pero muy, muy interesante, y empezar a confrontar las violencias de géneros y la violencia contra la reproductividad desde la imagen de Dios, creo que es muy, pero muy válido y que está en este contexto de un reto que tenemos de ya estar llamados a la vida, a la justicia y a la paz. Incluso recordaba yo escuchando esta intervención en los momentos más difíciles. Colombia es un país que ha vivido por más de 60 años un conflicto armado interno y en los momentos difíciles, digamos los picos que se recrudece la violencia y hay hasta reclutación forzada de niñas, niños y todo eso. Y yo recuerdo que las madres, las mujeres en Colombia salían a protestar a las calles y ellas gritaban un eslogan muy fuerte que a mí aún hoy me impacta y ellas decían, ah, no parimos hijos para la guerra. Y eso se convirtió en una expresión fuerte para evitar que sus hijos y sus hijas fueran reclutadas para matarse para matar a otros o para ser ellos víctimas. Y yo creo que es la dignidad del ser humano concebido como una imagen, como una creación de Dios, indistintamente de su posición social, de su estructura, de sus gustos, de sus pensamientos, de lo que sea. Es un ser humano y creo que además de eso hay que puntualizar que la creación a imagen de Dios puntualiza algo eh, después que Dios crea, ¿no? Y es que después que crea, Dios ve lo que crea. O sea, Él no crea y tira, ¿no? Dios ve lo que crea. Y dice el texto que cada vez que Dios veía que era bueno. Veía que era bueno. Y yo creo que eso es supremamente importante y que nos anima y que ayuda a nuestra autoestima para saber que aunque nos digan que somos malos, somos buenos porque somos hechura y estamos hechos a imagen de Dios y a veces también nuestros discursos religiosos han marginado a las personas de este gozo, de esta alegría y de esta esperanza de sentirse hechuras de Dios. Y creo que ahí tenemos un camino que recorrer y una experiencia de vida vivida y pensada Diosmente. Mil gracias.
Thank you, Anthony's. Kenneth Douglas.
Thank you. Just say two quick statements in relation to thank you for that, and in relation to that, two things. So when we think about reproductive justice, one, we think about creating the conditions for life to flourish, right? Creating the conditions for life to flourish. And we also think about protecting, yes, the sacred dignity of every human being, which means sacred regard for human bodies, right? And to your point, Antonis, that becomes so significant when we understand that at the center of Christian faith tradition is the incarnate, embodied reality of God. So the body itself is sacred. And so when we think about reproductive justice, it also means not doing violence to the body, to human bodies. So providing the conditions for life to flourish and not doing violence to human bodies. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kenneth Douglas. Thank you all. Thank you, Reverend Liz. Thank you to our interpretation team, Persis, Erica, Ricardo. Thank you so much. This was awesome. If you feel like somebody should have been here and they missed it, we're going to share the recording. You can check our podcast channel. It's just the Gender Justice Jam on Spotify. So look us up if you want. And we will meet again next week, same place, same time, continue the conversation about reproductive justice. And we're specifically going to be talking about some of the attacks on assisted reproductive technology from the perspective of people faith leaders who have experienced that, as well as the attacks, the ways that trans people's rights to have families are under attack and have been under attack. So thank you all again. Go in peace to love and serve God in the form of the Imago Dei and everybody you meet. Good night, everybody. Thank you again.